It's a special honor to be joined by Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg this evening. Rabbi Professor Steinberg is one of those people who really needs no introductions. I'm going to keep this very brief. Of course, joining us from Israel this evening, we're obviously mindful of the current situation, the security situation in Israel. I just want to say that we are very much, our thoughts and prayers are with you all on that side, and we send our support this evening from across the world. I want to thank the organizers, particularly to Dr. Elisha Kain, who was so instrumental in creating this evening, and the creator of Machon Torah Refuah, which I'm going to say just a few words about in a moment. Also to all the partnering shuls and schools and communities. We have Hendon United Synagogue, Magen Avot, Tiferet Hayal, the S&P Spanish and Portuguese community, Yeshurun of Edgewell in London. We have Steen Court and Yavne School in Manchester, and of course Mizrahi UK as well. But above all, as we said, Machon Torah Refuah, which is an incredible forum which was founded just a few months ago. A forum that brings together both senior Dayanim and Rabbanim with an expertise in the field of medical Halacha, together with medical professionals in the UK and abroad. There are many accomplished authors, rabbinic leaders, senior physicians that are part of this forum. And over the past year, I think we've seen just how important it is, particularly with new situations and challenges arising, to be able to share the information, to have an accurate understanding of the facts and the issues that are involved. When it comes to medical Halacha and when it comes to the interaction, the dialogue between Chokhmah Torah on the one hand and Chokhmah Mada on the other. And to have a channel like this is really tremendous. And when we talk about this synthesis, this dialogue between Torah and Mada, I think there is nobody who really represents the synthesis who can epitomize this quite like Rabbi Professor Steinberg, who is a world-renowned expert in this field of medical Halacha, of Jewish medical ethics. He is the director of the medical ethics unit at Shaarei Tzedek in Jerusalem, as well as co-chairman of the Israeli National Council on Bioethics. In 1999, he won the Israel Prize for original rabbinic literature for his 7-volume encyclopedia, single-handedly authored Encyclopedia Hilchatit Refuit in Hebrew, which is the most comprehensive book ever compiled on the subject. Been translated into English as well, as you can see on the screen, as the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics. And he's also the head of the editorial board of the Encyclopedia Talmudit, which again, you can see on your screen, some of the voluminous writings which he's been involved in. And for the past 30 years, Rabbi Professor Steinberg has really been at the forefront of the world of medical Halacha. He's been an advisor on medical ethics issues to the Knesset, to the chief rabbinate in Israel, and to many communities of B'nai Din around the world, including here in the UK. He has been in close contact with the most senior poskim around the world, including Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Eliashiv, Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Oldenburg. And as a world-renowned physician, somebody who's been able to share from his expertise, from his knowledge and from his experience. And as I said, it really, really is a tremendous honor to have him here speaking with us tonight. Tonight's subject is organ donation Halacha, something which Professor Steinberg has particular expertise in, was very instrumental as well in drafting the law in Israel, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. Let me just say, if anybody has any questions throughout the evening, please send them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. But without any further ado, it is my honor to hand over to Rabbi Professor Stein.
Thank you, Dr. Rabbi Kenigsberg, for your very kind introduction. And thank you, Dr. Elisha Khan, for organizing this meeting and giving me a chance to, to discuss with you one of the most debatable issues in current Halacha. I'll come to it a little bit later at the presentation, how a debate should look like and how it shouldn't look like. But certainly this is something that is of great concern from halachic and practical points of view. As was mentioned, I am heading now the Talmudic Encyclopedia. As you can see on the screen, 46 volumes have already appeared. In about a month, Yirtzeh Hashem, Mem Zayin will come out. It is going in a very nice pace. We hope to be able finally to conclude it within a few years after almost 80 years of work. I recently, maybe 2 years ago, published a new series of books called Refuah Halacha, which is updated compared to the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics and organized in a different way and primarily deals with the halachic issues rather than an encyclopedic way of entry, which covers ethical, historical, legal aspects as well. So I think this is something much more updated, and it's called Refuah Halacha. So we are going to discuss organ donation or transplantation, and actually almost every part of the body, whether it is a whole organ or whether these are certain tissues, can be transplantable nowadays, except for, lucky to us, that the scientific community doesn't even try to, and that is the brain. We can't transplant a brain. Obviously, the question will be, who was transplanted to whom? If the brain from Reuven came to the body of Shimon, who is Shimon? Is it still Shimon or is he Reuven? And obviously, that is beyond science, and that is not possible and probably shouldn't be possible. But other than that, as you can see, we can obtain tissues from live persons, such as blood, bone marrow, semen, ovum, and ovary, and we can obtain organs from what we will discuss later, brain dead people, such as the heart, intestines, liver, lungs, pancreas, and others. We can obtain other parts, whether we define the person dead as brain dead or cardiac dead, which is bone, cornea, face, kidney, limb, skin. And we can also obtain whole organs from a live donor, such as the kidney and partially liver and lung, and recently womb. So actually it covers every tissue and every organ that we know of. Some are life-saving, some are quality enhancing, but actually all this is possible. The history starts from actually cornea. Already in 1906, the first transplants of cornea was done, but organs have started to be transplanted only in the 50s and the 60s. It started from live donors of kidney, it went to dead donors of kidneys, and it went on, and we'll discuss a little bit at length the 1967 heart transplant, which opened the Pandora of the halachic discussion. And nowadays, as I said, almost everything is transplantable. Now, when we transplant an organ, there is the donor from whom we take the organ, and there is the recipient who takes the organ. Initially, when the success rate for recipients was low, it was an experimental procedure, and then there were debates whether one is permitted to be a recipient of an organ. We won't go into it. It has a very different halachic course, and I'm not going to discuss it. Nowadays, all those that were discussed as experimental are actually therapeutic. The success rate is very high. The treatment to keep the organs, not to be rejected, is very successful. And therefore, nowadays, it's like any other operation that you have to balance the risks on a particular individual patient. But the principle is that it is certainly permissible to become a recipient, again, contrary to poskim who at the beginning of the era of transplants were opposed to become a recipient. Now, the issue that we are going to discuss at greater length is the donor side. And what are the potential sources for organ donation to become a donor? So the best would be if we could create artificial organs or tissues, and that is beyond any halachic or ethical question. Obviously, if it's feasible, it can be done and should be done. However, interestingly, that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing for almost 6,000 years of millions and billions of babies who are born every minute all over the world throughout history, with all the organs, with the heart, with the lung, with the brain, with the liver, human beings so far are unable to create even the simplest full organ. We are able to get to the moon and to the Mars, but we can't create as simple an organ as the heart. And it sounds contradictory to say that the heart is a simple organ, but actually it is a simple organ because it's actually a pump. All that the heart has to do biologically, I'm not speaking metaphysically, spiritually, these are other dimensions, but from a biological point of view, the heart is a mere pump, and yet we can't create such a pump that will last for a long time, even such an organ. Certainly, we are unable to create the liver or the kidney, which are much more complicated organs, and that is not even in the vision. So that is not something that can be done for organs, but it has been done and is being done for particular tissues, such as parts of the heart, parts of bone, parts of skin. We can create substitutes of certain tissues. A second source, potential source, are animals, so that if we could take a heart from an animal and transplant it to a human being, halachically, certainly there is no question that this should be permissible. Whether the animal is a kosher animal or non-kosher animal, obviously it's irrelevant because we are not eating the heart or the liver that we are transplanting. There's no issue of this kind. And incidentally, the closest animal from an immunological point of view is the pig. And if it could have been possible to take a pig's heart or liver or kidney, that certainly would have been permissible. However, it is impossible for various reasons that I'm not going to go into at the moment. There is a potential, maybe in a decade or two, that it will become a reality to use stem cells and to develop from a stem cell a whole organ, either a stem cell coming from the same person who is in need of the organ or from another person, and then we probably will be able to reach a stage where stem cell biology will be possible to create organs, and then you will gain the time that you are listening now to me because there will be no shyness and this topic will not be a topic for discussion. However, at the moment, it doesn't exist. So we have three sources that we are using nowadays for organ donations as donor. Either human beings who are still alive and we take parts of them in order to save the life of others. The most notable is the kidney. A healthy person has two kidneys. He can live almost as good with one kidney, so he can donate one kidney while being alive to a person who has no kidneys, who needs dialysis or is failing on dialysis, and we can transplant it to him. That has different halachic questions and parameters, and I'm not going to discuss it. What we are going to discuss is the source of a donor of a cadaveric human being, namely a person who is diagnosed as being dead, and yet there are parts in him that are still alive, and those parts can be used as donors to people who are in need. And here we are talking about two ways to die, either a cardiac death or a brain death, and that is actually what we are going to discuss further in a few minutes. So there is an option to use a non-heart beating donor, meaning someone whose death death was determined by the fact that the heart stopped beating, and we are going to take out his organs, those who are still viable enough to be transplanted to people in need. This method has been developed in certain countries, primarily in Spain and in some places in the United States. There are two ways to use a non-heart beating donor. One is to have him in a state of actually cardiac arrest for whatever reason, heart attack, car accident, or whatever, and reviving him to a degree that he cannot really function clearly after this resuscitation, but that is pumping blood to the organs. And if we can do it within 6-7 minutes and take out the kidney or the liver, that can be used as organs to be donated. That is how Spain does it. They have organized it in a way that no other country is able to do it. Halachically, it has no questions because everyone agrees that cardiac arrest without being able to resuscitate is the moment of death. And if we can still have blood circulation for the few minutes until we take out the organ and the organ is viable, obviously we can use it. Logistically, it's very complicated to do, and hardly any country has adopted. The other way of so-called non-heart beating is to take a person on a respirator, disconnect the respirator in the emergency room. Prior to this, preparing the body with all kinds of solutions that will keep the organs viable. And once we disconnect the respirator, after a few minutes, the heart will stop, and then they'll take out the organs. That, by all halachic criteria, is the worst way to obtain organs because actually we are killing the donor in order to call him non-heart beating donor, which satisfies the definition of cardiac death, but actually we brought it upon him by a mindset, by an act, which is an act of killing, and obviously that is impossible. So a non-heart beating donor sometimes can be used for kidney who has a longer window to survive. But if we want to use only a non-heart beating donor, we can use it for skin, for bone, for cornea, but then we enter to a different chile, which I'm not going to go into, that are usually not life-saving procedures. Are we allowed to desecrate the body and to derive benefit from the body for a non-pikuach nefesh situation? Again, these are different issues, but they are hardly used. And what I'm interested in discussing now are the major life-saving organs that cannot be obtained from a non-heart beating donor. So the alternative way to obtain such organs is to use a brain dead donor, which is a debatable halacha whether a brain dead person is indeed dead by halachic criteria and therefore we can take out his organs, or he is still alive and despite the fact that his brain is dead, we still call him alive, and then taking out his organs is actually an act of murder. So this is the real question concerning organ donations. So in order to understand the issue and the machloikes, we have to define the moment of death. And there are various ways to define when a person is dead. One way is a biological death, which means that each and every cell in the body is dead, and only then are we going to call this person dead. That will be very late in the course, usually after 2 or 3 days after the heart and the brain are dead, and we'll discuss in a minute what the meaning of such a definition is. Another definition is the cardiopulmonary death or cardiorespiratory death, which means a total and irreversible cessation of both cardiac and respiratory functions. And then the person is dead, despite the fact, and I think it's important to realize, despite the fact that at this particular moment, there are still organs and tissues that are alive. At this particular moment, when the heart stops and the respiration stops, the kidney still functions, the liver still functions, the lungs are still viable to a certain degree, and they will die gradually after the heart will not supply blood and respiration will not supply oxygen. Another way to diagnose a person as dead is what we call a whole brain death, which is a total and irreversible cessation of all brain functions, including brainstem. And the importance of this inclusion is that in this situation, the person is not only not functioning with his cerebrum, with his higher functions, he's comatose, he can't think, he can't speak, he can't understand, but also the vital parts of life which are in the brainstem are not functioning, including the respiratory system. So a whole brain death person is a person who cannot breathe at all on his own, and he will never resume breathing. And that actually correlates with the next definition, which is respiratory death, which is perhaps only to look at the brainstem, no matter what the other parts of the brain are doing. And finally, a definition that is gaining some acceptance, although certainly very problematic, is what we call cerebral death, which is a total and irreversible cessation of the cerebral function, but the brainstem is still intact and the person is breathing, has sleep and wake cycles, his heart is functioning, and as I said, importantly, he is still breathing on his own, but he is in a vegetative state or in a comatose state, he can't communicate, and for some people, that would be enough to call him dead. So any definition of the moment of death has to be a total and irreversible cessation of the appropriate function. Either it is the whole biology of the person or the heart or the lung or the brain, whatever we choose as being the focus of the definition has to be total and irreversible non-functioning. Actually, any definition except for the first one, for the biological one, from a medical scientific point of view, is an arbitrary definition. We take a certain function, we say the person is dead because this particular function stopped working, although parts of him are still alive. So we just choose a certain organ or a certain function in the process of dying, and we say when this happens, we call this person dead, despite the fact that biologically some parts of him are still alive. So if we are talking about a biological death, that happened in the 19th century because of medical errors in establishing cardiorespiratory death. Currently, no one accepts it, and as we'll see in a minute, halachically, it is unacceptable. And what happened in the 18th century, wait, let me go back, I'll come back to the 18th century. The cardiopulmonary death is the quote unquote, the normal death, the historic death, and actually even today, most of us probably will die this way because the other definitions, which are respiratory or brain death definition, requires the person to be on a respirator, otherwise he will within minutes become a cardiorespiratory death, and therefore it has to be on a respirator. And most people don't die with a respirator, and therefore most people will die in a cardiopulmonary death. The whole brain death, which is a relatively new definition of death, is something that requires, as I said, the person to be on a respirator. It was initially defined in order to satisfy needs, such as people on respirators in the ICU who are brain dead, but their heart is still functioning. How long will you keep them there and prevent other people that you can save from entering the ICU? And especially, as we mentioned earlier, it is important for organ transplantation. The respiratory death, again, is similar to the previous one, and the cerebral death is very problematic because actually we are taking people who are breathing normally without a respirator, we're calling them arbitrarily dead just because they can't communicate with us. And where do you set the limits? How much of conscious and how much of intelligence do you require in order to be called quote unquote alive? So that is certainly something unacceptable halachically. Now, we discussed now many types of definitions for an exact moment of the death of a person. Why is it so important? Why not wait for a biological death? Wait until all organs and tissues and everything is dead, and then bury the person, and you are sure that he is dead. The reason is that from a halachic point of view, we need to know if the person is still alive or not by virtue of minutes. Because let's say it is Shabbos, and we need to desecrate Shabbos in order to treat him. We know that we are allowed to desecrate the Shabbos for a pikuach nefesh of a live person, but we are not allowed to do anything on Shabbos, desecrating Shabbos for a dead person. So it is very important to know exact moment, when is this person still alive and when did he become dead, so that we'll know how to deal with him on Shabbos. It has to do with mourning. When does mourning start? Inheritance, two people who die in different timings. We need to know the exact moment of each death to know who inherited whom. For murder issues, if we want to know if the person really killed someone, we need to know if he was alive or not. So from a historic point of view, how did people define the moment of death? Usually by a feather. They took a feather, they put it next to the nostril. If the feather moved, they said the person is still breathing and is alive. And if the feather didn't move, they said the person is not breathing and therefore he is dead. Interestingly, that in the 18th century, there were a lot of mistakes in diagnosing cardiorespiratory death because, as we said, respiration was checked by a feather and the pulse of the heart was checked by the ear. There were no instruments to know, and there were mistakes. People didn't hear heartbeat or people didn't see the movement of the feather, and they buried sometimes people alive. So someone invented and wrote a patent for a very interesting coffin. This is the level of the earth. You put in the coffin into the earth, you put the person, the dead person, into the coffin. In his hands, you put rope, and then there's an opening beyond the level of the earth, and at the top, there is a bell, and with this string, if he wakes up in grave, he can move the rope and the bell will ring. This is what's called saved by the bell. And that apparently was the origin of this issue. Now, at that time, the Prussian landlords decided that physicians are not to be trusted with the moment of death, and therefore they said you have to wait at least 3 days before you can bury the person. That created a big machloikes between Moses Mendelssohn and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavetz. I won't go into this machloikes, but it was a very interesting back and forth discussion whether to accept the ruling of waiting 3 days or not. The issue from a halachic point of view was that we are not allowed to postpone burial. It's an issue of Baltalin. And the question is, if he really was dead 3 days ago, then it's a biblical prohibition to wait the 3 days. And that was the question, whether to accept it or not. Interestingly, the 2 generations later, the Chassam Sofer, in one of his last tshuvas, while he still was alive, brings this machloikes from Moshe Mendelssohn and the Yavetz, and he says, וכמדומלי, הואיל במדינת קיסר ירום הודו, הורגלו להלין מטעם המלך וגדוליו, נשכח הדבר עד שחשבו לדין תורה ונחזר ענן. So what he tells us is that the Jews accepted the law of the land and they postponed the burial of people until according to what the king asked, and they thought this is the right way to do, and therefore the Chassam Sofer for the first time goes into defining the moment of death in order to know when should you bury the person. And it's interesting that you won't find in Shas, in Rambam, in Shulchan Aruch, a halacha that says a person who fulfills A, B, C is defined as dead. There's no such definition, clear definition. There are only definitions that we can relate to, which we'll do in a minute. And the Chassam Sofer actually was the first time, and so late in Jewish history, to define the moment of death. In the 20th century, there was the opposite direction. Instead of, in the 18th century, postponing the moment of death until the biological death, in the 20th century, they tried to bring the moment of death earlier by criteria of brain death rather than cardiorespiratory death. And the one that brought it in the front line was Christian Barnard, who did 2 heart transplants, who did many more, but 2 consecutive heart transplants in December 67 and in January 68. And it's an interesting story because this brought a lot of this halachic discussions around it. So the first heart transplant performed by Christian Barnard in this hospital, Groot Schroer in Cape Town. He took a heart from a car accident victim by the name of Denise Darwell, and he implanted it into the chest of Louis Washkansky, by the way, a Jew, the first one that a heart transplant was done to him. The second heart transplant came from a black person who collapsed a day earlier, and again it was transplanted to another Jew, Philip Bleiberg. The problem that it created was that in the beginning, the end of 67 and beginning of 68, there were no official criteria of brain death. And Christian Barnard apparently decided with his team what is the brain death, and therefore he could take out the heart and transplant it. The criteria, the medical criteria for brain death actually were published only at the end of 68, which are called the Harvard criteria, and we'll talk about it a little later. Now, Christian Barnard was apparently a very able and smart person. I had the fortune to visit the hospital in which the heart transplant, the 2 heart transplants took place. It became now a museum in Cape Town, which shows the progression of Christian Barnard's work. Here it shows the dogs that he transplanted in order to get used to do it and to learn the technique. And there was a lady, as you can see on the left, who actually participated in the first heart transplant with Christian Barnard. At the time that I visited Cape Town, she was alive, and she was willing to tell me exactly how it went. And why was it important to me and to everyone to know what exactly happened. The reason is that when this came out in the world, obviously it made a lot of news. It came to Moshe Feinstein, to his notice, to decide whether this is halachically acceptable. And his tshuva was, מה שאומרים הרופאים שסימני חיות ומיתה הוא במוח, שאם לפי השערותיהם אין המוח פועל פעולתו וכבר נחשב למת אף שעדיין הוא נושם, האמת ודאי שלא זה שפסק המוח לפעול הוא מיתה, וכל זמן שהוא נושם הוא חי. So what he was told was that Christian Barnard took out the heart from the donor because he regarded him as brain dead, but he was still breathing. And remember, this was before the Harvard criteria, which according to his, to Christian Barnard's understanding, that was sufficient to call him dead by brain dead, despite the fact that he was breathing. And therefore, Moshe Feinstein said that this is killing, retzicha, of the donor, because if he is still breathing and you take out his heart, you are killing him. And this Vashkansky, the first recipient of the heart, died after 18 days. It's a whole story, what mistakes were done, but he died after 18 days. So Moshe Feinstein paskened that it's a double retzicha. It is a retzicha of the donor because he was still alive by virtue of him breathing, and it was a killing of the recipient because without the operation he could have lived maybe a year, and now he died after 18 days. As I said, from the recipient point of view, things have changed dramatically, even in the days of Moshe Feinstein, and all those poskim who said you're not allowed to be a recipient didn't change their mind, but the reality changed that they are alive, and therefore that certainly is allowed. But from the donor side, according to Moshe Feinstein, the reason he thought it was forbidden was because this person that they took out the heart from was still breathing. I asked this lady what actually happened without telling her what Moshe Feinstein wrote. And she told me that not only wasn't he breathing on his own anymore, or she, it was a woman, not only didn't she breathe on her own, but even her heart stopped. And what Christian Barnard did was he prepared two operating rooms. In one was Vashkansky waiting to receive the heart, and in the other one was the lady on a respirator, severely brain damaged. He took her off the respirator. He waited for her not to breathe and for her heart to stop. He resuscitated her and took out her heart. So what Moshe Feinstein was told wasn't accurate, but from a halachic point of view, it was even worse, because actually what Christian Barnard did, he killed this donor in order to call her non-breathing, non-heart beating person and taking out her heart. But be it as it may, this opened a whole Pandora of halachic questions. Now, since the Harvard criteria and many years later, it became clear that we know the criteria. Time doesn't permit to go into the whole medical aspects, but as we know, the respiration is totally dependent on the brainstem. The lungs can be perfectly healthy, and yet if the brainstem is not functioning, the person cannot breathe on his own unless he's on a respirator, which is a mechanical respiration. And this is totally dependent on the brainstem, as opposed to the heart that has its own pacemaker. And even if the brain dies, it can continue to function as long as it gets the oxygen through the respirator. There are medical criteria how to establish the moment of death. They are very strict, they are very accurate. Most countries, including in the UK, they only use the first two sets, the prerequisite to be sure that indeed it's an irreversible situation, and the three clinical testings, which include the fact that the person is totally comatose, he has no brainstem reflexes, and he can't breathe on his own. In Israel, the chief rabbinate was not satisfied with this criteria, wanted to be sure that indeed it's irreversible, and in Israel there's a legal requirement to do a confirmatory test, which I'll show you briefly in a minute. So once we did all this, for sure the brain death situation is irreversible, the person is not breathing on his own, he can't resume breathing on his own, he's on a respirator, the heart and other parts of the body are still alive, and if you accept that this is the moment of death, you can take out the viable organs. Now, it is important to know why the person is brain dead. It's a severe trauma, it's a bleeding, it's edema. We won't go into the details. There are, as I said, clinical tests, such as testing that he's really fully comatose, no reactions whatsoever. There are brainstem reflexes, such as shining a light into the pupils, which usually constrict, and when the person is brain dead, especially brainstem dead, the pupils will not react. There are Dahl's eyes, and they are called calorics. And the most important test is the apnea test, where we disconnect the person from the respirator after giving him 100% oxygen for 10 minutes. We put a cannula into his tube so that he still gets oxygen, but not by machine. And we check for respiration after we get the maximum PCO2 level in the blood, which is an irresistible force to resume breathing. And if we get to this level of PCO2 of the maximum and he can't breathe, that is a sign that he is not breathing on his own, he will never breathe on his own, and that is the most significant test, both from a halachic point of view and from a medical point of view. However, as I said, there are confirmatory tests, there is all kinds of tests to make sure that indeed the brain is dead by objective criteria and not only by medical examination. And if we combine the medical examination, the apnea test, and one of the confirmatory tests, we can say for sure that this person is brain dead, including brain stem dead. But as I said, his heart and other organs are still functioning. So what are the halachic discussions? So everyone discusses the Gemara in Yuma in a case where a building collapsed on Shabbos and there is a person under the debris. You're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos in order to save him. And as long as you don't know what the situation is, you are allowed to continue to take away the debris even by Chilul Shabbos until you reach the person. Once you reach the person, you have to see if he is alive or dead. As we said, if he's dead, you can't desecrate Shabbos. If he's still alive, you're allowed to do whatever it takes in order to save his life. So the Gemara asks, Adei Chanu Bodek, where do you test him in order to know or to verify whether he is still alive or not? So one says, At Chotmo, you test up to the nostril, and obviously the meaning is not that you test the nostril whether it's existing or not. That is not a sign of life or death, but rather you are testing whether there is air coming out of his nostril. In other words, that he is breathing. And if there is no breathing, he is declared dead, and you don't have to check for any other functions. Yesh omrim ad libo, that you have to check his heart, supposedly, which probably is not the right interpretation, but at the moment we'll leave it as is. You check whether there is a heart rate, heartbeat, and this is the sign whether he is alive or dead. There's a whole discussion around this Gemara. There's a Yerushalmi that quotes it differently, that the one Chad Omar is really at Chotmo, But the Yesh Omrim is at taburo. You check his navel. And apparently what you check in his navel is respiration, because when you breathe, the navel is going up and down by diaphragmatic breathing, and the heart is not mentioned at all in the Yerushalmi, and almost in all Rishonim, in the Sugya and the Bavli, it is also said ad chotmo and ad taburo. Only Rashi and the Meiri have the Gersa ad chotmo and ad libo, which causes some difficulty because the continuation of the Gemara is Neima hanetanoe ke hanetanoe. The Gemara wants to compare this machloikes with another machloikes, and the other machloikes clearly mentions taburo, the navel, and doesn't mention the heart at all. So how can you compare if this is the Gersa? But that is something to be discussed at length at a different stage. But Le'inyan pikuach nefesh, says the Gemara, afilu Abba Shaul moide de'ika chiyuta be'apeyu. Everyone agrees that what counts life and death is only breathing through his nose. Dechtiv kol asher nishmat ruach chayim ba'apav. So we see that the neshama, which by the way etymologically neshama and neshima are the same source, and the neshama is defined as coming by the wind from the nostril. So this is the Gemara, and at the moment it seems like the importance is really the breathing, but there is a machloikes. How do you test the breathing? Whether you test it in the nostril, in the heart, or in the navel, according to the other shittas. How is the halacha paskin? If there's a machloikes, we need the halacha. So the Rambam says, "But ko ad chotmo velo matzu bo neshama, menichim oto sham shekvar met." So the Rambam paskins that all that counts is breathing. And if you will notice, he says velo matzu bo neshama. He doesn't even say velo matzu bo neshima, because neshama is the same concept, and ad chotmo means that he is dead. So according to the Rambam, you don't have even to check whether there's a heartbeat or any equivalent of the heart function. So also paskins the Shulchan Aruch that mefakchinu botkim ad chotmo, im lo irgishu bechotmo chiyut, az vaday met, lo shna pagu berosho tchila, lo shna pagu beraglav tchila. And the Chochmas Odom describes how to diagnose whether the person is really dead or whether he just fainted. And he says, נוהגים להניח אצל נחיריו נוצה, ואם נשאר מונח שם בידוע שמת, ואז אומרים תכף צידוק הדין. So it seems clear that all the poskim related to the breathing as the sign of death. Time doesn't permit me to go into the Chacham Tzvi, an interesting tshuva that it's clear that even the heart is related to the breathing function rather to the blood function, because in the old days, they didn't know about the small circulation, and they thought that the heart is pumping air, and that's actually the organ of breathing. The lungs are only a cooling mechanism over the muscle of the heart, and actually the Chacham Tzvi describes the heart as the organ of breathing, and according to him, breathing is the ikar of life. The Chassam Sofer, as we already mentioned, goes into discussing the moment of death. I think we'll have to skip it for the moment, and maybe if time permits in the question and answer, we can go into what he defined as the moment of death. But he actually brings the Gemara Yuma, the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos and the Shulchan Aruch, the Hakol Talui B'Neshimat Ha'af, that everything is dependent whether the person is breathing or not, and that is how he derives it from the Gemara. In our generation, since the advantage or the invention of brain death, there became a very heated debate between the poskim, And I think that in Machloikesen, the people who are dealing with it should respect each other, should understand what the other one is saying. They can agree or disagree, but unfortunately, in certain areas in the world, it became a personal fight. In other areas, it became a political fight, and I'm not going into it at all because I don't think this has to do with a machloikes in halacha. And by the way, there's hardly any issue in halacha that there is no machloikes. So it shouldn't be surprising that such a fundamental issue when the person is alive or dead is in a machloikes is not surprising. That is certainly the way that halacha has been developed. And nowadays you have to go according to your poisek. So Rabbi Elyashiv, Rav Wosner, Rav Waldenberg, they were of the opinion that the moment of death is a cardiopulmonary death, the way it used to be throughout the generations, and brain death, including respiratory death, is not a sign of death enough. You have to wait for the heart to stop. Obviously, according to their position, you cannot take out organs from a brain dead person because, according to this shita, he is still alive and taking out his organs is actually an act of killing. Rabbi Elyashiv, I had the privilege to discuss with him at least twice the issue of brain death. One, I'll tell you a little later regarding the legislation in Israel. He did not tell me, and I believe he didn't tell anyone that I'm aware of, why did he think that brain death is not sufficient and it has to be cardiac death. After he died, I asked Harav Efrati, who was very close to him, who went in and out and was like the guidance there for people to come to Rabbi Elyashiv. And he gave me all kinds of speculations why Rabbi Elyashiv paskent what he paskent. There are things that don't make any sense. It's hard for me to believe that Rabbi Elyashiv said it, but anyway, it's just a speculation. He didn't hear it himself from Rabbi Elyashiv. The same, Diane Simons asked Rav Zilberstein, who was a son-in-law of Rabbi Elyashiv, what was his justification for his psak, and also he just gave his opinion. Why did Rabbi Elyashiv think that way? But to the best of my knowledge, we don't know from Rabbi Elyashiv himself why he paskened the way he paskened. But clearly that was his position. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was very hesitant about this issue, and maybe you heard, maybe not, we don't have time to go into it, but he designed a medical experiment in order to relate to a certain sugya in Erchin, and it turned out from this medical experiment that in certain conditions of brain death, this is the halachic definition of death. However, the way we diagnose brain death today, he was hesitant whether this is really brain dead, and therefore he regarded a person that physicians call brain dead, this person to be sofek meis, sofek goises. That was his definition of this situation. Therefore, according to him, you cannot take out organs because you're not sure that he is dead, maybe he's still a goises. But since he is a goises, you're allowed to be meisir hamonea, and therefore you can disconnect him from the respirator when brain death was diagnosed the way we're diagnosing it today. It's complicated the way he got to it. I had the privilege to write up his position, as you see here, and I published it in his name, and he reviewed it before publishing and accepted it. So I think that in principle, he thought that full brain death, according to his criteria of brain death, is the death even if the heart is still functioning. However, the way we are diagnosing brain death is insufficiently certain, and therefore it is still esophagosis. That's the experiment with the sheep that we did in order to verify a certain sugya in Erchi. Now, Rabbi Feinstein's position was stated in at least 3 tshuvas, and there is a debate what his actual position was. I'll present to you what he wrote in his tshuvas, and everyone can choose what he understands. So I already mentioned the first tshuva right after the first heart transplant, that it is clear that according to Moshe, breathing is the sign of life and death. If he is breathing, he is alive. Meaning that he is not breathing and he will not breathe again, he is dead. He doesn't mention in this tshuva at all the heart. A second tshuva, he goes into a little greater lengths, and again he says that what counts is breathing, as we see in the Gemara Yuma, and if you can verify that the person is not breathing, then he is called dead. However, he says, those people are on respirators. The respirator is not a form of life, of breathing, because this is a machine breathing, and therefore this, according to him, is not regarded as breathing. So if a person without the respirator cannot breathe, although he is breathing on the respirator, he is regarded dead. And his final tshuva, which he wrote about half a year before he passed away, he wrote very clearly that he accepts the Harvard criteria, which means that brain death, including respiratory death, is the moment of death. And he adds, והנה אף שהלב עדיין יכול לדחוף לכמה ימים, מכל מקום, כל זמן שאין לחולה כוח נשימה עצמאית, נחשב כמת. Namely, even if the heart still can push or pump for a few days, he's already dead because he is not breathing on his own, and not breathing on his own is the single sign of death. That seems to be very clearly his position. Now, this last tshuva is, as you see here, was typewritten. Some have argued that since he was already very old and he never used a typewriter, so someone typed it for him. Although he signed it, perhaps the someone who typed it falsified his position. I think that is going very far to accuse Reb Moshe of being led into such an important issue to be falsified, but there is a handwritten letter by his son, Reb David Feinstein, who writes that it is absolutely not a falsification. That is, he says, was his position. I heard it from him. This is clearly stated in his tshuvas, and he writes at the end, לבירור הדברים, אם הוא שוכב כמת ואין בו שום תנועה, אף שהלב פועם, מאחר שאינו נושם, הוא כמת גמור. So very clearly he summarizes that if he's comatose, not moving, has no movements, is not breathing, although the heart is has a pulse, he is definitely dead. That is the position of Reb Moshe according to his son Reb David. The chief rabbinate of Israel was asked to rule on this when heart transplants became a reality in Israel in 1986. At that time, the two chief rabbis were Rabbi Avraham Shapira and Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, and they were asked officially by the Director General of the Ministry of Health, and they wrote a psak, a very lengthy psak, to say that in principle, brain death, respiratory brain death, is the moment of death, but they want to be sure that physicians are doing it in a way that it is really irreversible and that you can check it, and therefore they asked not only to diagnose it by clinical criteria, but also to add an objective confirmatory test. That created a huge dispute between the medical establishment in Israel and the rabbinic establishment. The physicians said, who are you, the rabbis, that are telling us how medically to diagnose brain death? We accept your principles because in principle, we as physicians can't make a decision in principle who is dead, who is alive. And if you decided that brain death is acceptable, how to diagnose brain death, it's our job and not yours. The rabbis did not agree. They wanted to be sure. And it went on and on for over 20 years until, by the way, it was confirmed by subsequent chief rabbis and by Rav Ovadia Yosef with a handwritten tshuva that brain death is the halachic death according to Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Shlomo Amar. And based on this position of the chief rabbinate and of the chief rabbis, a brain respiratory death act was written in the Knesset in 2008, which accepted totally the chief rabbinate's position against the medical establishment. By law in Israel, you have to have all these criteria, including a confirmatory test and including a teaching series of physicians who can be licensed to diagnose brain death so that he will know exactly what has to be done. And also we teach them in this course some halachic aspects and the importance of keeping everything strictly with dignity towards the dying person and towards the dead body. And this is part of the Israeli law, and there are many other parts in it which time doesn't permit to go in. And someone who goes through the course gets such a document, such a license, and he gets a number of his license, and only such people can diagnose brain death. Now, let me just finalize with a caveat in the Israeli law. Before the law was put forward in the Knesset for the last reading, Moshe Gafni, who is the head of Degel HaTorah, asked me to come with him to Abel Yashiv to explain to him what the law is going to be in order to get from Abel Yashiv directions how to vote on the law. And I explained to him that according to the chief rabbinats and the chief rabbis, that brain death is acceptable. It's a great achievement that the way we diagnose it by law will be according to the chief rabbinate and not according to the physicians. So he answered, that is very nice, according to the Shita that holds that brain death is acceptable, but I don't accept it in principle. So all these adjustments are not helpful. So I told him what would be his position if we will add a paragraph that says that people who don't accept brain death in principle, either for religious or philosophical or whatever reasons, if they don't accept it, the person should stay on a respirator until the heart stops, according to Rabbi Yashiv's position that the heart is important even in these circumstances as a definition of death. So he told Rav Gafni, if this paragraph will be added, vote against the law, but make sure that the law passes. Now, there were different interpretations why he said so and what was his idea. We added this paragraph, it was accepted in the Knesset, and at the last voting, everyone in the Knesset voted for the law, except for Gafni, who went up on the podium and said, it's a terrible law, we can't accept it. And I was sitting there and he waved with his hand. And later he told me that he told them, the other members of Knesset, that he has to go against it, but actually you can go ahead. I'm just voting against. And then Shas wanted to know from Rav Ovadia Yosef how to vote. And that is when we came to Rav Ovadia Yosef together with Rav Amar. And he clearly paskened that brain death is acceptable. And he told Eli Yishai, who was then the head of Shas, vote for the law without exceptions. This is how Halacha is. So these are some of the aspects regarding organ transplants if we accept the concept of brain death. There are other halachic issues, and with this I'll finish, with taking out organs from a dead body, no matter if we define him dead by cardiac or by brain death. There is the issue of desecrating the body, nivul hamet. There is the issue of isur hanoah, you're not allowed to derive benefit from the dead body, and bitul kvura, because you're not burying those parts that you take out. So these are all isure deoraisa. How can we do it when we take out organs? The clear answer is that we are doing it for pikuach nefesh. And pikuach nefesh is doiche Shabbos, is doiche Yom Kippur. Certainly, it's doiche these lavim or mitzvos esse, and therefore that is a non-issue halachically. The only issue is, can we take out the organs if the person is indeed dead? Otherwise, we are killing him. And that's where the whole discussion comes about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Professor Steinberg, for an absolutely fascinating presentation as always. Such a comprehensive and clear overview of both the halachic and the medical aspects, and of course, sharing those anecdotes and those personal stories of the interaction with the poskim was very, very special to hear. We have a little bit of time for questions. I'm going to hand over now to Rabbi Finchas, who has a question.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Professor Steinberg, for your presentation. If I understood correctly, and what I've read from your articles, that brain death is not really a definition according to the Halacha. Cessation of respiration is the definition, but brain death, if you like, is like a diagnosis of cessation of respiration, and that's why it's called the brain death respiratory law. And as you're an expert on this subject and a neurologist, I would like to ask if you can bear with me, because I do have a question in medical and in the Halacha, because I think on the one hand, it might be more accurate to say that with the dysfunction of a brainstem, that it's the cessation of ventilation, of inhaling and exhaling, not necessarily the cessation of respiration. The ventilator replaces the diaphragm and the lungs are working fine and respiration continues. And further, the Gemara in Gittin and Yuma makes it clear that even if somebody cannot breathe, or if their trachea has been cut, they are still not considered dead unless they lie motionless. And it's well researched and documented that brain dead can display a number of spontaneous movements of reflexes, even those who have had confirmatory tests. And the scientific answer is that these movements are not mediated by the brainstem, rather they are spinal reflexes. But that answer would make sense if you understand brain death as a definition of death. If it's a diagnosis of a cessation of respiration, the source of those movements will make no difference, as I understand it. And even though the Gemara does talk about of Pilkus and the lizard's tail, but it's clear that this will only be vis-a-vis the cessation. It won't apply to the cessation of respiration, and rather hutazavosh, which is decapitation. And I did read in one of your articles where you did give extra weight to Rabbi Dr. Tendler, that in '76, he wrote a scientific paper on brain death. And I want to quote something from there. He writes, absent intracranial blood flow over a 10 to 15 minute interval is uniformly associated with subsequent necrosis and liquefaction of the brain. And in another article he wrote, if you wait another 24 hours, the brain begins to liquefy. If you turn the body upside down, the brain would flow out through a hole in the head. That's what brain dead means, end quote. And that's the exact language of Moshe Feinstein, which you quoted, where he talks about nirkav hamoach legamre or mamash mitakel. And I saw the chief rabbinate also quoted a letter by Rabbi Tender who wrote in '85 about respiratory brain, and Professor Somer also wrote, it's put in Asia, about the autolysis of the brain. So this is the point I'm getting to. In 2008, when the Israeli law did come out, at the same time, the American Academy of Neurologists published a research paper by Elko Widricks, who shows that the neuropathology of the brain dead had changed considerably since that time. And I just want to quote, and I'll finish with this quote. He writes like this: total brain necrosis, respiratory brain, has been a common finding in the distant past. And in his conclusion, he writes that total brain necrosis is not observed. We found no prototypical example of respiratory brain, end quote. So my question is, in essence, according to this and according to the Moshe Feinstein, until you can prove that it's actually liquefied, brain death wouldn't be a definition or even a diagnosis of cessation of respiration, rather a prognosis that he will die shortly. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about this, and thank you very much again.
Well, you said so many things that I'm not sure I can go into each of them. First of all, the principle. The brain death definition from a halachic point of view is the cessation of spontaneous respiration. Why do we need the brain, or why do we need the heart? If the heart was once the sign of death, and the Gemara says that respiration is the sign of death, why do we need the heart? Or now, why do we need the brain? The understanding of those who accept respiratory death is that cessation of respiration, like the Gemara says, if you check the nostril and there is no air coming out, or like the Chochmat Adam says that you put a feather and there's no movement, meaning there's no respiration coming out of the nostril, the person is dead. The problem is that if you will do today such a test on a person, it might still be reversible. In the days of the Gemara, if there was no breathing, there was nothing to do. So the person would be defined dead by respiratory criteria, because this is the final situation of no respiration. Whereas nowadays, the person who is not breathing might resume breathing. And therefore, in order to verify that it is irreversible, not that the source is the brain, we don't find the brain as a criteria of death anywhere in Shas. The Gemara doesn't talk about the brain as such. The Gemara talks about the function of respiration. Why do we need the brain death criteria? To verify that the person will never resume breathing. And as I said, any definition of death has to show an irreversible function of what you call dead. So if you call the heart dead, you have to, if you call the person dead by heart criteria, you have to check the heart in a way that it will be irreversible. Because if it's reversible, he is not dead. We don't know how to do Tchias HaMesim. So the mere fact that he is not breathing or there's no heartbeat is insufficient. So in the case of breathing, which is the halachic criteria according to the understanding of the chief rabbinate of Rabbi Yosef, and will come to Moshe Feinstein, if this is whether he is alive or dead, we need the brain criteria only to verify that it's irreversible. So respiration is the fact of life or death. ויפח באפיו נשמס חיים, וימח כל אשר נשמס חיים באפו. That is how the Gemara quotes the pasuk. The Gemara doesn't say that the brain was liquefied or not liquefied. The Gemara doesn't go into it. The Gemara talks about a function. The function is breathing, and if he's not breathing, he is dead. If he is breathing, he started life. That is how we learn from the psukim. So we adding the brain as a verification that it is irreversible. So that is how I understand the situation. Now, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, in one of the three tshuvas, writes indeed that the brain has to be liquefied. But he writes very clearly that all depends on breathing. Why did he want the brain to be liquefied? I assume because Moshe Tendler, his son-in-law, who was in the medical field, understood then that to verify brain dead, you have to reach the situation of a liquefied brain. And only then will it be irreversible. But we know today that it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how the brain looks, if it's more liquefied or not. What counts is the brain stem. And the brain stem includes the center for breathing. This gives the order to the lungs to breathe or not to breathe. And if the brain stem is totally, irreversibly dead, this person is not breathing on his own and will never breathe on his own. And as Moshe Feinstein wrote very clearly, based on apparently people who asked the same question that you asked, maybe by the ventilator, he is still called breathing as a respiratory function. So he says very clearly, the fact that a machine is doing the movements of breathing is not called breathing. Breathing is only if it comes spontaneously. That is a machine. If you will take out the lung from a person, you'll put it on the table, you'll connect it to a ventilator, it will breathe. It doesn't mean that because the lungs are doing the function of breathing, the person that are lacking the lungs are still called alive. So that is an artificial way of breathing, and there are poskim, I agree, that view this as being a function of breathing, but Moshe clearly wrote it's not, the chief rabbis wrote it's not, and obviously you can choose, you can accept that as another way of deciding a definition of death, but clearly Moshe didn't hold that way. Now, Reb Shlomo Zalman had this idea when he asked for this particular experiment, and he talked about Huta Zarosh. There's a Mishnah that says, Huta Zarosh metame be'oel. What's the chidush? That if you chop off a head, the person is defined dead. Obviously, he's dead. Says the Mishnah, Afal Pishe Mefarkes, despite the fact that he has still movements. And Reb Shlomo Zalman told me once that he remembers chickens running in his yard when they chopped off the head and the chicken continued to run. So there was movement. And since movement in the old days was considered one of the significant signs of life, one would have thought that Huta Zarosh is not dead yet as long as there are movements. So says the Mishnah, no, once Huta Zarosh, he is metame be'oel, he is dead. Says Reb Shlomo Zalman, what happens in Huta Zarosh? What happened there? The fact that the nose isn't connected, the ears are not connected, obviously are irrelevant. What happens there is that the brain is not controlling anymore the breathing because it's in a different location. So he said, in order to verify brain death, you need to show me that each and every cell in the brain is dead the same way as Huta Zarosh, which is totally detached from the body. And we can show it, but in order to do it, you need to move the patient to do testings to show that indeed the brain is totally and irreversibly destroyed. Therefore, he introduced the fear that maybe he's still esophagosis, and esophagosis you're not allowed to move. So you can't bring him to a place where you can test whether the brain is still having some cells alive or not. So therefore, he stayed with this position of Sofek Goyse, Sofek Meis. But according to those who say that breathing alone is the sign of death and the brain is irrelevant, the same way as the heart are irrelevant for the definition of death. They are only there in order to verify that it's irreversible. So in the old days, the person died because he wasn't breathing, and they checked the heart, and if the heart didn't work anymore, then we know that he will not resume breathing. The equivalent today is to check the brain, which does the same thing. And if you know that the brain is not functioning, therefore the person is dead. So if you go by respiratory death, and if you go according to the Gemara in Yuma, if you go according to the Rambam, if you go according to Moshe Feinstein, to Ovadia Yosef, all those hold that breathing spontaneously or non-breathing spontaneously irreversibly is the definition of death.
Thank you very much. I still understand that a brain dead person is the cessation of ventilation, not the cessation of respiration, but respiration continues. And like I said, the movements, it's been well documented that they move, and that, according to the Gemara, and Rashi says this clearly, as long as there's movement, and I'm not talking about the heart, there can be many different movements, but again, I think there's a clear difference between ventilation, and that is what the brain stem is actually controlling, not the respiration. Respiration continues.
How does respiration continue? By the
Because
machine.
All the ventilator does is take over the diaphragm, lets in air and out. But who's changing the air from oxygen to carbon dioxide? That's the body's doing that by itself. It's nothing to do with the brainstem. The brainstem does not control respiration. That's why a brain dead person continues to respirate. Even an apnea test just proves respiratory acidosis, that we see versus carbon dioxide going up. It doesn't prove that he's not ventilating, and that's what we need. But the bigger issue is the movements. There are movements with brain dead people. The Rabbanut and the Moshe didn't speak about that, but that's clear from the Gemara.
So the movements, I hear you. The movements are reflex movements from the spine down, and they come from the spine and not from the brain. And movement, as the Mishnah says, "Hutas harosh metame be'oil, af al pi shemefarkes." If there are movements there, they are irrelevant because he is not breathing, because he has no brain function. So movements per se is not a sign of life and not a sign of brain function in a brain dead person. And in an apnea test, there is no respiratory movement at all, neither by the diaphragm, nor through the nostril, nothing. He's not breathing at all, despite the fact that PCO2 reaches a level that if anything in the brainstem would have been alive, no one could resist breathing. So therefore, it's to me very clear that the fact that a person is not breathing, has no spontaneous movements of breathing, cannot do respiration because he can't move neither the diaphragm nor the lungs without the control of the brainstem, and therefore the person is dead. The fact that I'm putting him on a ventilator, which exchanges oxygen and PCO2 mechanically, that is not a sign of life.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll send you what I think about this, but I think the body's changing the oxygen to the PCO2, not the ventilator. The ventilator is just a mechanical action, but the body is changing. The exchange of gases is done by the body, even on a brain dead person.
Okay. The hour is late. I'm conscious of time in Eretz Israel. Thank you very much again to Rabbi Professor Steinberg. Thank you to Rabbi Kenigsberg. And thank you to Rabbi Finches. We look forward to having many more, perhaps at an earlier hour in the night, where many more webinars with you, and hopefully we'll see you in London, Bezrat Hashem, very soon, or we'll come to you in Eretz Israel and spend time with you and have the wonderful conferences that you organize on a regular basis in good time. And thank you again for everyone for joining us. And B'ezrat Hashem, we'll announce very shortly our other events that are forthcoming in the next few weeks. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, Professor Steinberg.
Kol tov, and please say Tehillim for Israel. We really need prayer, and hopefully things will settle. And it's not only the war, it's also inside Israel. We have a lot of trouble now, and well, jury can help by prayer.
Indeed.
Hopefully for Bsorot Tovot,
Amen.
and Shabbat Shalom, and Chag Sameach, and thank you for organizing this meeting.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Professor Steinberg, and everyone else for joining us. Kol tov. Thank you. Bye-bye.